Hey, everybody. Good to see you again for Grace with Paul Gray. Taking some time these days to contrast the real gospel, Paul's gospel, what he calls the gospel of grace, and what he calls a distorted gospel or a perverted gospel. And he tells about that in Galatians chapter 1, verse 6. He started the church in Galatia and he started teaching these people who they weren't Jewish people. They didn't know anything about the real God at all. And so he started them in grace, taught them the grace message, taught them his gospel of grace. And then after a while, some Judaizers from James, who was the head of the church in Jerusalem, came in and said, well, yeah, Paul's stuff is good, but you got to add all of these other things, which were the law, the Jewish law. And Paul writes to him and he said, man, I'm just amazed. I'm astonished. I can't believe how quickly you guys have turned away from my gospel of pure grace and embraced a perverted gospel or a distorted gospel. And I mean, those are pretty strong words. And we learn from that today. You just cannot mix law with grace. In Romans 10:4, it says, Christ is the end of the law. As a matter of fact, 1 Corinthians 15:56, Paul says that the law is the power of sin. That's what gives sin its power, having laws against things. So when we look at the pure gospel of Jesus and of the Apostle Paul, as opposed to a mixed gospel that people who still believe that you got to have some law in there, when we look at comparing those two, we see grace on one side, pure grace, as one great grace writer said, pure 200 proof grace, no ice, no water, nothing added. Pure grace on one side, and then we see a mixture of some grace but law. It can be the laws of Moses, can be the laws of the church, can be laws that your parents put on you, whatever, So under the pure gospel of Paul and Jesus, there is no law except for the law of love. Jesus' law that he loves us unconditionally, one way, with no limits, no exceptions, no qualifications or anything. So anytime you hear from a pastor, from somebody on the radio or on TV or online, or you read in a book, or you're sitting around talking with some religious people, anytime you hear you got to do this, you should do this, you ought to do this, you can't do that, anytime you hear law, you know that's not the gospel. That's a perverted gospel. That's an other gospel. That's a way less than perfect gospel. It's a distorted gospel. All right. When you hear the true gospel, you're always going to be assured of your righteousness. You're going to be encouraged to have a righteousness conscience, to believe and know and be confident that you are righteous. When you hear a perverted or a distorted or another gospel, it's going to focus on sin consciousness and that you are unrighteous and that you have to do things to try to become righteous. And a good example of that is Deuteronomy chapter 28, which is a chapter that I would certainly encourage everybody to stay away from. It's the epitome of the law. It starts out in the first half of it that says, if you do this, then God will bless you. Second half, it says, if you don't do this, and in both cases they list out a whole bunch of things, then it says God will bring these terrible, terrible curses on you. And it lists, all the different curses. See, that's under the old covenant of the law. Today, God's blessing, there is no if-then. God blesses us because that's who he is and that's what he's like. He is good, and the good God blesses us. He makes the sun shine and the rain fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. He blesses everyone because he is good. A false or perverted gospel, a distorted gospel, will say, no, you got to do these things to get God to bless you. And then, of course, the effort is on you. And then, if it doesn't appear that God is blessing you, then there must be some sin in your life that's keeping God from blessing you. The whole thing, a mixture of law and grace, well, it's just awful. The wages of sin is death, not spiritual death, although no, not physical death, although it can cause physical death, but it's primarily spiritual death. And sin itself is what punishes us, not God. So, just a little bit more on the true gospel from what Jesus calls his Father, the only true God, which Paul calls his gospel, the gospel of grace, and a distorted or perverted or another gospel that comes from religion that adds law to grace and, in effect, negates grace. All right. Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.